Democracy took 3 bullets to the chest and barely anyone noticed. A raid that sent shockwaves through Washington's power elite. A firing that shattered decades of economic independence. A power grab so subtle it looked like paperwork. Most people saw political theater, but what if these weren't random acts of government chaos? What if they were the opening moves of something far more sinister? Because here's what history teaches us. Dictatorships don't announce themselves with dramatic manifestos and marching armies. They slip in through the back door while everyone's watching the front. They steal your freedoms so quietly, so methodically, that by the time you realize what's happened, the cage door has already locked behind you. The question isn't whether it can happen here. The question is, has it already started? So in today's video, we're going to connect the dots. Because if we don't, we risk missing the most dangerous truth of all. Dictatorship doesn't begin with a bang, it begins with silence. Now, when headlines flash across our screens today, we might roll our eyes and think, just more Washington chaos. After all, isn't DC always buzzing with firings, resignations, scandals, and investigations? But what if we paused for a moment and looked beneath the surface of these recent events? What if the leadership shake-up at the CDC, the Federal Reserve President's dismissal, and the raid on John Bolton's home aren't just isolated incidents of political turbulence? What if they're pieces of a larger, more troubling puzzle? Let me walk you through each one. Most of us don't think about the CDC unless there's a pandemic or a health scare making headlines. The Centers for Disease Control sits quietly in Atlanta, publishing reports, tracking diseases, crunching numbers. Boring stuff, right? But here's what makes the CDC dangerous to those in power. It deals in facts. Cold, hard data that doesn't bend to political spin. When people are dying, the numbers don't lie. When a policy fails, the statistics tell the story. And sometimes, often actually, those facts become politically inconvenient. This is why authoritarian leaders have always targeted institutions like the CDC first. In Stalin's Soviet Union, famine statistics disappeared when they made the regime look bad. In China, early COVID warnings were suppressed to avoid embarrassing local officials. Control the data, control the story. So when we see sudden leadership changes at the CDC, when seasoned experts find themselves sidelined, we have to ask ourselves, is this really about competence? Or is someone making sure the facts align with the preferred narrative? Because once you silence the truth, power rushes in to fill that vacuum. On to the next, shall we? Now, the Federal Reserve might seem even more boring than the CDC, just a bunch of economists in suits adjusting interest rates. But make no mistake, the Fed is one of America's most powerful institutions. It literally controls the flow of money through our entire economy. What makes the Fed special and essential to democracy is its independence. It's deliberately insulated from political pressure because politicians have terrible incentives when it comes to money. They want interest rates slashed before elections. They want the stock market pumping to boost approval ratings. They want to print cash for popular programs without the messy business of raising taxes. The problem? Those short-term political wins often create long-term economic disasters. That's exactly why the Fed was designed to resist political meddling. But when a president starts firing Fed officials, that independence crumbles. We've watched this movie before in places like Turkey, where Erdogan fired central bankers who wouldn't play ball with his economic fantasies. The result? Runaway inflation and a currency in free fall. Once politicians control the money supply, they control everything else. They can reward friends and punish enemies. They can make entire regions prosper or suffer based on political loyalty. So we have to ask, was this Fed dismissal really about policy differences, or was it about seizing control of the economic levers that touch every American's life? Then there's John Bolton. Love him or hate him, Bolton isn't some fringe character. He's Washington establishment through and through, a former national security advisor, foreign policy heavyweight, connected at every level of power. He's exactly the kind of person you'd think would be untouchable, which is precisely why the raid on his house sends such a chilling message. Authoritarian playbooks are full of strategic prosecutions and high-profile raids designed not just to punish, but to intimidate. The logic is simple. If someone as connected and powerful as Bolton can have his door kicked in, what chance do the rest of us have? Think about the mid-level government employee who's witnessed something troubling. Think about the journalist digging into corruption. Think about the political rival considering whether to speak out. What do they think when they see Bolton's house being searched? They think, keep your head down, stay quiet, don't make waves. That's how dissent dies, not through mass arrests, but through the quiet spread of fear. People censor themselves before the regime even has to censor them. Step back and look at these three incidents together. At first glance, they seem completely unrelated. Health policy here, economics there, national security over there. But the pattern becomes clear when you consider what each one really targets: truth, money, and dissent. These are democracy's three pillars. When you can shape what people believe to be true, you control their reality. When you can manipulate the economy, you control their survival. When you can silence opposition, you prevent resistance before it even forms. This isn't speculation, it's the authoritarian playbook, refined over decades and implemented across continents. The moves might look routine, even boring, just another day in Washington's political circus. But sometimes the most dangerous transformations happen right in plain sight, disguised as business as usual. The question isn't whether we're seeing that pattern emerge. The question is this: what are we going to do about it? The authoritarian playbook. Now, if I asked you to picture authoritarianism, there's every chance your mind conjures dramatic scenes: tanks crushing protests in city squares, constitutions torn to shreds, opposition leaders hauled off in chains. We imagine crowds roaring for strongmen, dramatic coups, the sudden collapse of everything we thought was stable. But that's not how it usually happens. Real authoritarianism is far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. It doesn't kick down democracy's front door with jackboots and manifestos. Instead, it picks the lock quietly, slips in through the back, and makes itself at home before anyone notices the house has been robbed. It works like carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless, deadly. By the time you realize you're in danger, you're already too weak to escape. And if you study how democracies actually die, you'll discover something chilling. The playbook is almost always identical. Russia under Putin. First, independent media was brought to heel through pressure and violence. Truth. Then oligarchs and financial institutions were forced into loyalty, money. Finally, critics were systematically jailed, poisoned, or exiled. Dissent. Result: a hollow shell of democracy hiding authoritarian control. Turkey under Erdogan, universities and the media faced increasing pressure. Truth. Central bankers were fired until one agreed to implement destructive policies. Money. After the failed coup, thousands of journalists and political opponents were imprisoned. Dissent. Result: democracy in name only. Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro. Independent reporting was systematically restricted. Truth. Oil revenues and central bank policy became political weapons. Money. Opposition leaders were jailed, exiled, or worse. Dissent. Result: economic collapse wrapped in authoritarian control. Hungary under Orban. Media independence was steadily eroded through legal and financial pressure. Truth. Banks and financial institutions faced political interference. Money. Civil society groups and critics were targeted through raids and restrictive laws. Dissent. Result: what Orban proudly calls illiberal democracy. The details change, but the sequence remains remarkably consistent. It's as if there's a universal instruction manual for dismantling democracy, and everyone seems to be reading from the same playbook. So here we are, in America, watching these same patterns emerge. We're not Russia yet, we're not Turkey or Venezuela or Hungary, but authoritarianism doesn't need to look identical to be lethal, it just needs to follow the same basic logic. Now you might be wondering, why all the alarm over some firings and a raid? Why should we care about what looks like routine Washington drama? Why does any of this matter right now in this moment, instead of someday down the road? The answer cuts to the bone, because once authoritarian foundations are poured and set, tearing them down requires nothing short of chaos, conflict, or complete collapse. And right now, right this very moment, we're living through democracy's most vulnerable season. Look around. The world feels like it's coming apart at the seams. Families are struggling with inflation that won't quit. Trust in institutions has hit rock bottom. The CDC, the Federal Reserve, even our courts have been dragged into partisan warfare. People are exhausted, cynical, ready to throw up their hands and walk away from the whole mess. This isn't just unfortunate timing, it's the perfect environment for authoritarianism to take root. Dictators don't seize power during golden ages. They don't rise when people feel secure and optimistic about the future. They thrive in moments exactly like this one, when citizens are scared, tired, and desperate for someone, anyone, to make the chaos stop. That's when the promises start flowing. I'll bring stability, I'll restore strength, I'll give you control. And to people who feel powerless, those promises sound like salvation. This is why those seemingly mundane firings and raids should terrify us. They're not just administrative housekeeping, they're test runs. They're checking whether anyone will push back, whether institutions will resist, whether the public will even notice. They're taking democracy's pulse to see how weak it's gotten. Every time democracy has died, the warning signs were there, every single time. In Turkey, it started with firing central bankers who wouldn't play ball. People shrugged. Economic policy disagreements happened, right? But each dismissal concentrated more power in Erdogan's hands, until he controlled not just politics but entire livelihoods. In Russia, Putin began not with dramatic mass arrests but with routine prosecutions and strategic house raids. Critics disappeared one by one, each case seemingly isolated, until suddenly there were no critics left to disappear. In the 1930s, Germany, democratic institutions weren't destroyed overnight in some dramatic coup. They were hollowed out methodically, appointment by appointment, law by law, precedent by precedent, until nothing remained but the shell of democracy wrapped around authoritarian control. The pattern never changes, it's always gradual, it's always disguised as normal governance, and it's always met with the same public response. This isn't that serious, it's just politics, someone else will handle it. Until suddenly there's no one left to handle anything. But let's make this personal for a moment, because authoritarianism isn't just about losing abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. Those words that get thrown around in civics classes and political speeches. It's about your paycheck when independent economic institutions get politicized and the economy lurches from crisis to crisis based on political whims rather than sound policy. It's about your family's health when public health agencies get purged of experts and replaced with yes men who tell leaders what they want to hear instead of what they need to know. It's about your safety when corruption grows unchecked because the people who used to investigate it have been silenced or fired. It's about your children's future when education, science, and truth itself become casualties of political power games. These aren't distant philosophical losses, they're bread and butter, kitchen table, real-world consequences that will show up in your daily life whether you're paying attention to politics or not. But hold on, before we start stocking up on canned goods and updating our escape plans, let's take a breath, because there's another way to read this story, one that's far less dramatic and possibly more accurate. Maybe what we're witnessing isn't the birth of American authoritarianism. Maybe it's just democracy being its usual chaotic, frustrating, imperfect self. Think about the CDC situation. Health agencies get new leadership all the time, especially after major crises. When strategies fail or trust breaks down, heads roll. That's not necessarily about silencing science, it might just be about accountability, or incompetence, or genuine policy disagreements about how to handle public health emergencies. The Federal Reserve drama? Presidents have been feuding with central bankers since the institution was created. Nixon browbeat Arthur Burns, Johnson strong-armed William McChesney Martin. Even Obama faced Fed pushback during his presidency. Every administration wants monetary policy that makes them look good, and sometimes that creates friction with economists who have different priorities. Is that really evidence of a creeping dictatorship, or is it just the eternal tension between political ambition and institutional independence playing out exactly as the founders intended? And then there's Bolton. Yes, the timing feels suspicious. Yes, it sends a message. But what if that message isn't "we're coming for our critics"? What if it's simply, we follow evidence wherever it leads? If federal agents had credible reasons to believe someone mishandled classified documents, should they ignore it because the person is politically connected? That's not authoritarianism, that's the opposite of authoritarianism. That's the rule of law working exactly as it should. Maybe the only reason this feels ominous is because we're already primed to see authoritarianism everywhere we look. We have courts that regularly tell presidents no. We have a press that investigates everything. We have opposition parties that turn every controversy into primetime theatre. We have civil society organizations that push back on government overreach before most people even notice it's happening. For every Nixon trying to pressure the Fed, there was a Watergate investigation that brought him down. For every attempt to suppress scientific data, there were whistleblowers who leaked it. For every power grab, there was pushback. So if you're one of those who believe that these are just coincidences, you might tend to agree with the above. However, history behooves us to revisit the data and to notice the pattern emerging. Something doesn't seem all right, and there's nothing wrong with pointing out the patterns and problems. In conclusion, we now stand at the crossroads that will define the next chapter of American democracy. We can recognize these warning signs for what they are, the early stages of authoritarian consolidation, and push back while pushing back still works. If we shrug now, if we laugh it off, if we dismiss it as just another week of political noise, then someday soon we'll wake up in a country we don't recognize, asking ourselves how it happened. The answer will be simple. It happened because we let it. Or we can tell ourselves this is all just normal political theatre, that someone else will fix it, that it can't happen here, that we'll deal with it later when things get really bad. But here's the thing about later. By the time everyone agrees that things have gotten really bad, the tools for fixing them have already been systematically dismantled. The question isn't whether we'll face this choice. We're facing it right now, at this moment, whether we realize it or not. The only question left is, what are we going to choose? Because democracy doesn't die from external invasion or dramatic coups. It dies from 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 moments when good people decide to look the other way, 1,000 times when citizens choose comfort over courage. History is watching. Our children are watching. The future is watching. The window is still open, but it's closing fast. What are we going to do while we still can? So, what do you think? Do you think America is headed towards a dictatorship, or people are just crying wolf? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. And if this conversation sparked something in you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories and in-depth dives like this.